Harry Fletcher. George? That laugh was the moment everything changed for Daniel. I'm Tom, and after 26 years of teaching, I've seen how much students struggle with confidence. That's why I created Arthur and this village, to show you a different way to learn. Let's step back into the pub and see what Arthur has to tell Daniel. It was one of those afternoons when nothing much seemed likely to happen. The Kelsy Arms was quiet. A few locals sat scattered around the room, nursing pints and discussing the weather. Arthur sat at his usual table near the window. George sat opposite him, and Daniel sat between them, enjoying the warmth of the pub and easy company. Outside, a light drizzle drifted across the village green. Inside, George was explaining why modern tractors were far too complicated. They've got computers in everything now, he said, shaking his head. When I started farming, if something broke, you got a spanner and fixed it. Arthur smiled. And what if that didn't work? You got a hammer. Daniel laughed. The pub door opened. A man stepped inside, paused for a moment, and looked around the room. Arthur glanced up. Then his eyes widened. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Harry Fletcher. George? The next moment, all three men were laughing. How long's it been? Asked Arthur. Harry thought for a moment. Must be 5 years. More, said George. Harry pulled up a chair. Mind if I join you? Arthur laughed. After 5 years, I think we'll allow it. Introductions followed. Harry shook Daniel's hand. Pleased to meet you. You too, said Daniel. A fresh pint arrived. The conversation began. So, said Arthur, leaning back, what's happened to you? Harry laughed. Work mostly. Still on the railways? Not now. Retired 2 years ago. George raised his eyebrows. Retired? You sound surprised. You always looked too stubborn to retire. Harry grinned. I tried it for 6 months. And? I got bored. They all laughed again. So what do you do now? Asked Arthur. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. Which means? My wife says I spend most of my time getting under her feet. That earned another round of laughter. Harry began talking about his final years working on the railway. One story led to another. A discussion about locomotives became a story about a workshop. The workshop became a story about an apprentice. The apprentice became a story about a station master. The station master somehow led to a discussion about village dances. Nobody seemed entirely sure how. Daniel listened. At first, he paid close attention to the words. Then he became interested in the stories. Harry had a gift for storytelling. Every tale seemed to lead naturally into another. He spoke about freezing mornings on railway platforms, about practical jokes played on new apprentices, about repairing engines in workshops that smelled of oil and hot metal, about characters he'd worked with decades earlier. The more he talked, the more the others remembered. George interrupted with stories of his own. Arthur corrected details no one else could remember. Time passed unnoticed. A few minutes later, arguments broke out over dates. Nobody agreed on anything. Everyone enjoyed themselves. At one point, Harry asked Daniel a question. Daniel answered. He joined the conversation again. Soon Daniel was no longer thinking about whether his English was correct. He simply wanted to know what happened next. The apprentice, the station master, the missing toolbox, the railway inspector, the stories had become more important than the language. Almost an hour passed before Harry finally glanced at his watch. Good heavens! What? Asked George. I promised to be home by 6. Arthur laughed. Then you'd better get a move on. Harry stood. Hands were shaken. Promises were made not to leave it another 5 years. Then the door closed behind him. For a few moments nobody spoke. George took another long drink from his pint. What do you think of him? Daniel smiled immediately. The story about the apprentice was brilliant. Arthur said nothing. And the station master, who blamed everybody except himself. George laughed. That sounds like him. And the toolbox, Daniel continued. I was certain someone had stolen it. Arthur remained silent. Daniel carried on. The best bit was when they discovered it had been hanging on the wall all the time. They laughed again. This is the part where most English learners get stuck. We focus so much on the grammar that we forget the human connection. Listen to how Arthur explains this to Daniel. It's a game changer. You haven't complained about missing words. Daniel said nothing. You haven't mentioned grammar. No. You haven't talked about understanding accents. Daniel frowned. Arthur continued quietly. You weren't listening to English. A silence settled over the table. You were listening to Harry. For nearly an hour, he had forgotten he was learning English. He'd not been analyzing sentences. He hadn't been translating. He hadn't been worrying about mistakes. He'd simply been interested. Interested in another human being. Interested in what happened next. Interested in the conversation. The language itself had disappeared. When children learn their first language, they don't study words because they love words. They learn because they're curious. They want to know what's happening. They want to hear stories. They want to talk to people. George smiled. The language is just a vehicle. Arthur nodded. Exactly. George took another sip of his drink. I remember learning to drive. Oh dear, said Arthur. George ignored him. My instructor kept telling me to stop looking at the gear stick. Daniel smiled. What happened? I nearly drove into a hedge. Arthur laughed. Several hedges. George pointed a finger. The point is this. He leaned forward. The day I stopped staring at the gear lever was the day I started driving properly. Daniel smiled. I think I understand. Arthur nodded. For years you've been staring at the gear stick. The three men sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the rain had stopped. A patch of evening sunlight appeared across the village green. Daniel looked through the window. For the first time since arriving in England, he wasn't thinking about how much English he still needed to learn. He was thinking about Harry. The railway stories, the apprentice, the missing toolbox, the laughter around the table. And suddenly he understood something that no textbook had ever taught him. The breakthrough had not happened when his English became perfect. The breakthrough happened when, for one ordinary afternoon in a village pub, he forgot he was speaking English at all. Daniel realized that fluency isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. Have you ever had a conversation that changed how you see English? Let me know in the comments. I'm Tom, and I'll see you in the next story.